How many countries do you know of that make whiskey? I bet there are a lot more than you think. Hey there, I'm Nath Martin, the Whiskey Scribe. Taste is subjective, whiskey is diverse, and this channel is about understanding it well enough to enjoy it on your own terms. Now, there are plenty of countries that are synonymous with making whiskey. Things like Ireland and Scotland. Most of us know about America, Canada, and even Japan. But there are always new countries popping up releasing a whiskey that we didn't even know were laying down barrels. So I wanted to do a deep dive into every single country in the world that is making whiskey to a commercial standard. So not just some home distilling set up in the back shed. And I was blown away. There are so many more countries making whiskey than I first thought. And I've tasted a lot of different countries' whiskies already. I'll give you a final tally at the end, but for now, why don't you pop a number in the comments below, just as how many countries you think are making whiskey, and we'll see how that compares. But because there were so many, I've broken this down into regions. So I'm going to go through, first of all the countries in Europe, then Asia and Southeast Asia and Oceania. Then I'll do all of the Americas, so North, Central, and South America, and then finish up with Africa and the Middle East. Now, throughout the video, I'll have a map that pops up here. This is not to scale. This is just to show you where the country is in relation to the rest of the region. And for each region, I'm going to be going through the countries in alphabetical order so that it's showing no favoritism and it's completely not political, because this is not about politics. This is just about whiskey. So let's kick things off with Europe. Starting with Albania, which released its first whiskey this year. Called the Glauk, it's a blended whiskey that claims to be distilled and blended in Albania. And there are more Albanian distilleries already starting to lay down whiskey barrels. In Armenia, there is one distillery producing Highland whiskey. It's 100% malted wheat whiskey aged in mountain oak barrels and finished in Armenian brandy barrels. Austria started producing whiskey in the 1990s, and today they have around 15 distilleries, producing everything from rye to blends and single malts with age statements as high as 21 years. Some of the key distilleries are Reisetsbuur, Old Raven, and Peter Affenzela. Azerbaijan has a growing whiskey industry that you might be surprised to know has an export market. A few products worth noting are Rodeo, a 5-year-old blended whiskey, and Yacht Club whiskey, a 7-year-old blended grain. They both use local and imported grain and sometimes age in ex-cognac barrels. They have relatively low domestic consumption, but a very high export market into Russia. Belarus has a number of distilleries using Scottish methods to produce single malt and blended whiskies. Narok Distillery, Brest Distillery or Belalco, and Paritskaya Vinanya are a few of the producers of Belarus whiskies today, and I do not know if I pronounced that correctly. Belgium started producing whiskey in 2004 and had their first single malt release in 2007. Today there are 5 distilleries producing whiskey, including Belgian Owl, Gouden Carolus, Filiers Distillery, and Waterloo. As Belgium is quite well known for beer, their whiskies are usually made using locally grown barley and aged in beer barrels. Bosnia saw its first whiskey distillery established in 2016, and it's unclear when their first whiskey was actually released, but Bos Tourus won gold for its whiskey in both 2020 and 2021, and is touted as being the first Bosnian whiskey, implying the existence of possibly a second Bosnian whiskey. Bulgaria produces Black Ram, a prominent blended whiskey, Savoy whiskey, as well as Esperitus, which is a single malt rye whiskey aged in mulberry barrels, which has me really intrigued. While Croatia is more known for Rakia, a fruit brandy, whiskey is starting to take off there too, and there are a number of new distilleries producing whiskey, including Croatian Rose, Ferrata, and Skykin, making 4-grain whiskey. Cyprus's first whiskey was Lion Spirit Single Malt, aged in Commandaria barrels, a renowned Cypriot wine, but we also have Kythria Single Malt. Both of these whiskies are made from barley grown on the island's volcanic soil, which is meant to give it some really unique flavors. The Czech Republic not only makes whiskey, but has been doing so since 1984, with the first whiskey release of Hammerhead. Strong name. Other locally made whiskies include Trebich, Old Hunter's Rye, and Martin's Barrel. Next we have Denmark. Now, if you're a fan of single malts, you've probably already heard of Storning Distillery, which has international distribution for its single malts and its rye whiskies. But there are also Danish distilleries like Fari Locan, Brunstein, Thornius, and Thai Whiskey. England is not necessarily new to making whiskey. In the 1800s, there were a number of distilleries with production to meet global demand, but the last recorded English distillery closed down in 1901. It wasn't until 105 years later that the English distillery was established in Norfolk in 2006. And they released their first whiskey in 2009, being the first modern legal English whiskey. Since then, over 30 more distilleries have opened up in England producing whiskey. Some worth mentioning are Bimba, White Peak Distillery, Cotswolds, and the East London Liquor Co. Estonia actually has at least 2 commercial whiskies. You have Tam and Rukas, an Estonian rye malt whiskey produced at Mo Distillery, and Alta Fine Single Malt produced at Alta Distillery. Finland has 2 prominent distilleries. You got Cairo Distillery producing a malt rye whiskey, and Tirempelli Distillery producing a single malt. France. I love French whiskey. I've reviewed a few French whiskies on this channel. And for a while there, France was actually the largest importer of Scottish whiskey. They haven't cut back. The Indian market has overtaken them because that market is growing. But France has actually been producing whiskey since 1983. And they still have several whiskey producers in the country, including Armoric, Brenne, and Michael Couvreur, to name just a few. But France also has regions. Much like their wine regions, you have whiskey regions in France. So if you get a French whiskey, you might see that it's been made in somewhere like Brittany, Alsace, Lorraine, and even the Cognac region is also a whiskey region. Georgia, the country, not the US state, also has 2 prominent whiskey brands. You've got Jimshire, which is the first whiskey in Georgia and known for blending Scottish whiskey traditions and Georgian winemaking traditions, and Alexander Distillery, which ages its whiskey in large clay pots traditionally used for winemaking. And this is what I'm talking about when you're discovering whiskey made in other countries. Whiskey made in ways beyond what is considered traditionally Scottish or Irish. German whiskey first hit the market in 2002, but today there are over 20 distilleries in Germany producing whiskey, including Hammerschmied, Black Forest, and Blackwood. Just last week, I actually reviewed a German whiskey from a small farm distillery called Singer Distillery, and that was aged in chestnut barrels and was absolutely beautiful. Gibraltar is home to 1 whiskey distillery, the Gibraltar Distillery Company. Super original name. Among gin, they produce Blackstrap Cove single malt whiskey, aged in ex-bourbon and Pedro Jimenez casks. Greece produces whiskey at a number of different Greek distilleries, including Athens Distillers & Co. Hungary has a number of distilleries producing whiskey and other spirits, but they only have 1 distillery that's wholly dedicated to producing whiskey. That's the Gemenk Distillery, which uses local grains and traditional methods. In Iceland, the Aimverk Distillery started producing whiskey in 2009, which it releases under the Floki brand. So far, they refer to themselves as being Iceland's first and only whiskey distillery, but at the moment it looks like a number of gin distilleries in the country are also laying down whiskey barrels. Ireland has been making whiskey longer than anyone. Seriously, they're the first country to ever make whiskey. And while their industry may have taken a little bit of a back seat to the Scottish for a while, they're making quite a comeback. I recently did a video on the rise and fall and rise of Irish whiskey, so if you want to understand the full history and the origins of whiskey itself, check that one out. Isle of Man is home to 1 single whiskey distillery, the Manx Whiskey Company, which since founding in 2019 has released quite a few different single malts. They keep things very small scale, producing around 2,000 bottles per year, focusing on garage whiskey culture. Italy's first whiskey distillery was Puni Distillery, which was founded in 2010 and released its first whiskey in 2015. Since then, a number of new distilleries have popped up, but Italy was actually known for independent bottlings as early as the 1960s and 70s. In fact, Silvano Samaroli was the first non-Scottish, non-English independent bottler of Scottish whiskey. Latvia's first whiskey was a rye whiskey made in 1993 and released as LB whiskey. Following its release, commercial whiskey production began in 1999, and there still seems to be at least 2 distilleries in the country still producing whiskey today. The Netherlands actually have a few distilleries producing whiskey that you would usually see referred to as Dutch whiskey. The most notable of which is probably the Zuidam Millstone, which makes a wide range of whiskies, but their 12-year-old sherry cask is absolutely beautiful. But there's also Frisk Hinder, which was the first Dutch whiskey released in 2007. You can also find Hugout and Horstman. Next we have Norway. Now the Norwegian whiskey industry is growing and characterized by the use of Arctic waters, craft production, and unique aging practices. Now I've never come across a Norwegian whiskey, but I'm really keen to give them a try because they seem to lean into the terroir, the way the natural environment affects the whiskey. Some distilleries use desalinated salt water, local barley, and even local peat. Some even finish their whiskies in teak casks, and there's this rapid aging process that happens from the changing Arctic climate. Brands to look out for are Aurora Spirit, producing Bifrost Arctic single malt on a former NATO base, Myken Distillery, and Det Norsk Bryggeri. Now when you hear Poland, you probably think of vodka, but Poland also has an emerging whiskey industry that's producing single malt, rye, and wheat-based whiskies. Look out for brands like Paprocki Single Malt, Wild Fields for a wheat whiskey aged in Polish oak, and Starka, which is a traditional Polish rye spirit aged in wood barrels, sometimes for decades to celebrate the birth of a child. And if it's rye-based and aged in barrels and a spirit, I think that actually classes it as a whiskey. And then you've got Portugal. Now, the whiskey industry has long used port barrels from Portugal to age whiskey. Portugal actually now has an emerging niche whiskey industry. Vanaki Distillery has led the way with small batch blended whiskies aged in Portuguese wine casks. And some of these expressions have even received solid reviews in the Jim Murray Whiskey Bible. Romania. So industrial whiskey production is relatively new in Romania, and it's being led by the Alexandrian Group, who released the Carpathian single malt as the first whiskey made in Romania with 100% malted barley and water from the sub-Carpathian hills. A few other distilleries have also released some small batch single malts. Russia has long preferred either vodka or imported scotch, but there's now a young dynamic market for premium local single malts. As a result, we have Kemlia Distillery producing reportedly dry style single malt that performs well in taste tests against international brands, and Alvisa Whiskey Distillery, emerging as the country's first industrial scale producer. There are also some small distilleries in Russia that have been producing small batch single malts made with local grains and traditional aging techniques. Scotland. Do they make whiskey? As the second country to ever produce whiskey, Scotland has definitely dominated the whiskey market for the last century. Their industry is very well established, with a strong industry body that represents, promotes, and protects the Scotch whisky brand internationally. While Scotland is one country, they have defined key whisky making regions that are probably better known than some of the smaller whisky producing countries I'm listing here. Speaking of, Serbia. Also known for making rakia, they do actually have at least one distillery producing a single malt. Two Doves whiskey was first released in 2016 and is considered a regional taste as it is aged in Serbian oak. Now, I've actually had a few Australian whiskies aged in Serbian oak, and it produces some really nice, interesting, almost like spicy wood characteristics, so I'd love to taste an actual Serbian whiskey aged in their own oak. Slovakia has a history of grain spirit production, Gozolka, going back as far as 1747. But the country established its first whiskey distillery, Nesville Distillery, in 2008, and officially released the first Slovakian whiskey in 2012. It typically releases whiskies with a mixed mash bill of corn, rye, and malted barley, but it has also released single malts, small batches, some high age statements, and has even won awards for the best European whiskey. Slovenia is a late entrant into whiskey production, but has hit the craft whiskey ground running. Broken Bones Distillery released the first Slovenian single malt in 2020 and the first peated whiskey in the same year. But since then, 2K Whiskey has released a Highland-style peated whiskey, and Beriška Distillery has released a premium 5-year-old whiskey made entirely from local Slovenian grains. Spain is another one that whiskey drinkers will usually know for the barrels, the sherry barrels that come out of Spain and we age a lot of Scottish and Irish whiskies in. But the country's been making whiskey for over half a century. The first Spanish whiskey was released in 1963, and today there are several Spanish whiskies on the market from distilleries like DYC, Basque Moonshiners, Distillerias Aca, Distillerias Liba, and Santa Maria. These whiskies are usually single malts made with local Spanish barley, natural water from the mountains, and aged in sherry casks like Pedro Jimenez and Oloroso, and also Spanish wine casks. Now, Sweden did have a foray into the whiskey industry in the middle of last century. There was a state-owned whiskey brand, Skipet's Whiskey, produced between 1955 and 1966. This was a mix of malt whiskey and grain spirit from two different Swedish distilleries, but interestingly enough, the malt whiskey was actually made using stills that had been purchased from the mothballed Bladnoch distillery in Scotland, in the Scottish Lowlands. Now, these were peated whiskies that were considered too smoky for 1960s taste, so the whiskey didn't sell too well and they ended up discontinuing it. But I love peated whiskey and I would really like to try them. Since then, Sweden has re-entered the whiskey market with Macmara Distillery, releasing the first modern Swedish single malt in 2006, which led the way for other Swedish distilleries like Smogen, High Coast Distillery, Spirit of Fen, Gotland, and more. In fact, there are around 20 distilleries in Sweden today, producing whiskies with really unique characteristics like Swedish smoke, which is made by burning juniper branches, aging in Swedish oak, which produces more spicy characteristics, and even aging in fruit wine casks like lingonberry, cloudberry, or blueberry wine. Now, I've tried the Macmara Swedish oak casks and it's really nice and very flavoursome, but I would love to try a blueberry wine cask. Now, Switzerland used to have a law that banned the production of distilled spirits using bread grains, but that law was overturned in 1999 and the industry was really quick to respond, releasing the first whiskey in 2002 by Locker Brewery. Now there are over 20 whiskey distilleries in Switzerland, such as Langton Distillery, Ormer Whiskey, Ragenbrau, and Brenier Kramer, to name a few. Swiss whiskey is known for being fruity, woody, and complex, and is often made with alpine grains, natural spring water, and can even be aged in like alpine caves and even ice caves, which is really, really cool. Some distilleries have even aged their whiskey in 130-year-old beer casks. Now, Turkey has made it onto this list on a technicality. So from 1964 to 2011, Ankara whiskey was made by state monopoly Tekel. It was an affordable 5-year-old whiskey made from malted barley, grains, and rice. Rice is a grain, so that still counts as a whiskey, and was meant to reduce the reliance on imported brands. It was actually quite popular at one stage, but over the years with the privatization of the company when it was purchased by Diageo, it eventually saw some decline in sales and it was discontinued in 2010. Since then, there hasn't really been a whiskey made in Turkey, but they do have a brand, KA Spirits, which is an independent bottler that imports whiskey for single cask releases. Ukraine released its first locally produced whiskey in 2008 with Mikulinetsky, or M whiskey. They make single malt whiskey using locally grown malted barley and age the spirit in oak for up to 10 years. There's also the Maklev family distillery. They've been laying down barrels since 2019 with the aim of creating a recognizable profile of Ukrainian malt whiskey. And then we're going to head back to the UK to round out this list. So in Wales, when I was last there were 2 distilleries. You had Aber Falls and Penderyn. But things have really been ramping up there. And in 2024, a group of distillers came together and approached the Department for Environment, Food and Rural Affairs to grant Welsh whisky a geographic indication. So now, Welsh whisky must be made using 100% Welsh malted barley, use water of 100% Welsh origin, and be produced in Wales at all stages from brewing to bottling. So there are now 7 working distilleries in Wales producing whiskey, with 4 of them having actually released whiskey. And that's Penderyn, Aber Falls, Darmil, and In the Welsh Wind. So that's Europe, and now we head over to Asia, Southeast Asia, and Oceania, starting with my home, Australia. If you can't recognize the accent, I am Australian. Now, whiskey's been made in Australia probably a lot longer than you think. In the 1820s and 1830s, a number of distilleries started up here with colonial settlers, especially down in Tasmania, where the growing conditions were just ideal for growing good barley. However, in 1839, whiskey production in Tasmania was banned, which closed down a lot of distilleries. There were a number of distilleries throughout the rest of Australia that did continue, but the industry just slowly declined, and eventually the last whiskey distillery in Australia closed down in 1989. Now, the laws around spirit production in Australia were so tight that it made it almost impossible to start a new whiskey distillery. So when the last one closed, it didn't look like we were going to get any more. But then Bill Lark fought to have a lot of the laws overturned, especially the ban in Tasmania. And as a result, in the mid-90s, Australia started to get a new whiskey industry. So Bill Lark started up Lark Distillery, and he also used that as a platform to teach other people how to make whiskey. And as a result, today we have over 100 whiskey distilleries in Australia. Now, this whole history of Australian whiskey is incredibly complex and probably needs a video of its own, but a few of the Australian distilleries that have got international distribution, so you're likely to see them and worth looking out for, are Lark Distillery, Hellier's Road, Sullivan's Cove, Starward, and Morris Whiskey, which comes from Morris of Rutherglen, an internationally renowned winery that's known for award-winning fortified wines. So now they also make whiskey and age it in their fortified wine barrels. Bangladesh may make whiskey. Alcohol is heavily regulated in Bangladesh, and you actually need a permit to be allowed to drink it. However, there is a state-owned distillery called Karoo & Co. It's the only licensed distillery in the country, and it reportedly makes a yellow label malted whiskey and imperial whiskey. Now, there is very little information I was able to find about the distillery itself, so it's unclear whether this is a grain-based spirit that they've used to make whiskey or if it's based on sugarcane, which is kind of common in the area. But the bottom line is there is a distillery in Bangladesh that is making a product that they're calling whiskey. Now, in Burma, or Myanmar, depending on when you went through high school, whiskey is actually the most popular spirit. It's widely consumed, it's affordable, in fact it's even cheaper than beer. But Myanmar Distillery Co. produces Grand Royal whiskey, with a few different expressions, so a few different labels out there, but it's reportedly made from a combination of Scottish and local grains, but all distilled and aged in country. Now, in Cambodia, if you go out asking for Khmer whiskey, what you're probably going to get offered is some really rough moonshine. It's made from rice. Rice is a grain, could be whiskey, but it's often unaged and possibly even sold in plastic bottles from street vendors. But there is a commercial grade Cambodian whiskey being made in country called Holy Creek. It's a Jack Daniel's style corn-based whiskey that reportedly tastes similar but still somehow unique. I'd give it a go. China. Now, 25 years ago, the whiskey market in China was basically Baijiu and imported Scotch. Now, Baijiu is a grain-based spirit, but it's clear and unaged, so not whiskey. But flash forward to today, there are over 50 distilleries in China producing and exporting commercial whiskey products. Now, the only Chinese whiskeys that I've tried so far come from Laizhou Distillery, which is an award-winning distillery, and I highly recommend you check them out. But a few other distilleries worth looking at are Daiqing, Go Along, Nine River Distillery, and Quancheng, which won World's Best Blended Malt just this year. India today has a rapidly growing whiskey market. They recently overtook France as the bigger importer of Scottish whiskey, but they've technically been making whiskey in the country since the 1820s. During colonial times, there were distilleries there that were producing a whiskey product, but it was sugarcane based. So the rest of the world wouldn't really call that a whiskey. I'd call that a rum. I don't know why they called it whiskey. But it was Amrut distillers in 1986 that pioneered malt-based whiskies in India. But things really kicked off for Indian whiskey production when Amrut released an Indian single malt in Glasgow, Scotland in 2004. Now, I do really love Amrut whiskies, and hats off to them for being pioneers, but a few other Indian whiskies worth checking out are Paul John and Rampur. Indonesia's first single malt was released in 2005 as Keris from Putasti Dhamma Admikti Distillery in Bali. I'm just gonna put the word down here. It is aged in American oak and finished in sherry casks and has won awards at international whiskey competitions. You also have a couple of other blended whiskies like Batavia and Omrak. Now, if you really are a whiskey lover, you would have to know that Japan makes world-class whiskey. Their industry kicked off in 1923 when the Yamazaki distillery was founded, but has grown to be its own class of award-winning sought-after whiskey with over 100 distilleries, utilizing unique local features like Mizunara casks, pristine waters, and blending spirits from multiple Japanese distilleries. Key Japanese whiskey brands worth trying are Hakushu, Yamazaki, Hibiki, and Nikka. But for something that is really uniquely Japanese, try Kajura. It's an Okinawan indica rice-based whiskey that is sensationally unique, but still whiskey. Korea. Whiskey is made in Korea, both Koreas. In South Korea, there is one distillery. They're producing a Scottish-style single malt under the label Key One. They first began releasing whiskey in 2021, and the Key One Unicorn, which is a whiskey made from Highland peat, is a really solid dram and a great whiskey coming out of a country that has never had a whiskey industry before. But of the Koreas, North Korea was the one who first released a whiskey in 2019 in order to compete with the luxury spirit market. It's called Samilpo and is available in 40, 42 and 45% ABV. Unfortunately, I probably won't ever get a chance to try this one, but if you're going to release a whiskey to compete with the luxury spirit market, maybe don't make it look like Johnny Red. Mongolia has been producing a millet-based spirit since the 1890s. Now, millet is a grain, it's a small seeded grass, but I can't find anything about this spirit being aged in any way, so we can't really call that whiskey. But that's okay, because they're about to enter the modern whiskey market. The Inner Mongolia Distillery project began laying down barrels in 2023. And while there isn't a release date advertised, this isn't a small project. They brought in equipment from Scotland, effectively an entire distillery, and have a production capacity of 500,000 litres annually. So keep your eye on them. Nepal has a growing craft whiskey industry. Now, most of what's on the whiskey market there at the moment is a combination of Scottish whiskey and local spirit, but that's usually a bit of a precursor to 100% locally made whiskies. But Schlock whiskey seems to be locally produced. But even if it's not, the Himalayan distillery that produces it is investing in a large maturation centre to leverage authentic Himalayan aging. So this is another country to be watched. New Zealand's whiskey history is actually kind of similar to Australia's. It kicked off in the early 1800s with Scottish settlers, and that eventually evolved into a commercial whiskey industry very much dominated by Wilson's or Willowbank Distillery, and then collapsed in the mid-90s. It was in 2009 that whiskies were released in New Zealand again, but these were rescue releases that came from barrels left over from the Willowbank Distillery. But since then, there have been a wave of New Zealand distilleries releasing highly regarded whiskies, notably from Thompson Whiskey, Cardrona, Wahiki, Pocono, and the New Zealand Whiskey Collection, which is the company that purchased the old barrels from the Willowbank Distillery and started releasing those, but they've also been making their own spirit. So they're now releasing the South Island Single Malt, which is made entirely at their new Dunedin distillery. While Pakistan has technically been a dry country since 1977, with alcohol consumption banned for Muslims, they do have locally produced spirits for non-Muslims and foreigners. The Muri Brewery is the primary producer of alcohol in Pakistan and makes a surprisingly large range of whiskies, including Vintage Gold, VAT No. 1, Dew of Himalayas, Raj Reserve, and the 8-year-old Marie's Malt Whiskey Classic, and even a 12-year-old Millennium Reserve. For years, these were made only for local consumption, but as of this month, export has been approved for countries like the UK, Japan, Portugal, and Thailand. Papua New Guinea produces one whiskey, the Captain Moresby Premium Whiskey by Vitis Industries. It is a 3-year-old blended whiskey made from Australian wheat, New Zealand oak, but produced and aged entirely in PNG. The Philippines have had a growing craft whiskey industry since 2019, and in true craft style, all of them seem to be different. So you've got brands like James Whiskey, producing a small 100% corn-based spirit, Witchcraft Distillery, producing single malt made from imported barley and local spring water aged in the Northern Highlands, and Crow's Single Malt Whiskey, recognised as the first Filipino single malt focusing on small batch cask strength releases. Singapore is also new to the whiskey market, having released their first rice whiskey in 2021. This was the Hom Mali Rice Whiskey by Rochelle the Rabbit Distillery, and is exactly the kind of thing I'm talking about when I want to try new world whiskies. Something that's different to tradition, but still made with flavour in mind. The first Singaporean single malt followed shortly after in 2023. Brass Lion Distillery released a 3-year-old single cask single malt whiskey in 2 variations, a 48% and a 65%. Taiwan has been making whiskey since 2005, and if you're a fan of single malt, you're probably aware of Kavalan Distillery, which pioneered Taiwanese whiskey and really took advantage of the subtropical climate, which causes a lot of accelerated aging to happen. Now, I truly rate Kavalan whiskies, and they're definitely well worth a try, but some other brands to check out are Maowiki Distillery, Holly Distillery, Guyun, Omar, and Yushan. Thailand has one single malt called Prakan, which was first released in 2024. It's made using copper pot stills imported from Scotland, and their range includes select cask, double cask, and even a peated malt. Lastly, Vietnam is another new player in the craft whiskey game. You have Som Khai Distillery, which created a uniquely Vietnamese whiskey made from a mash bill of malted and solid state fermented nixtamalized dent corn, red flint corn, and white purple glutinous corn. I don't really know what that means, but they're meant to be heirloom corns passed down through generations and uniquely Vietnamese. But you also have Vay Day D Distillery in Hanoi, which will be releasing their first premium single malt whiskey in 2027, made from a new make spirit that won Best in the World at London's World Whiskies Awards in 2025. With all of Asia covered, let's cross the Pacific now to the Americas. And I'm going to be doing this in clumps, starting with North America, Central, and then South America. And that starts us off with North America with Canada, which has been making whiskey commercially since 1821. And yet the first legal distillery was established in 1832. I love that distinction between legal and not. The industry was largely pioneered by English, German, and Dutch settlers who were distilling surplus wheat to prevent spoilage. It was the Dutch and German immigrants who introduced a small amount of rye grain to add flavour to the whiskey, contributing to the Canadian profile. And strangely enough, Canadian whiskey today can still be called rye whiskey even if it doesn't even have rye grain in the mash bill. Today, most Canadian whiskies are blends of corn, rye, malt, and wheat to produce brands we know like Crown Royal, Canadian Club, 40 Creek, and lot number 40, which is actually 100% rye whiskey. But there's also a growing craft scene producing wonderful single malts like Shelter Point, Glen Breton, and Macaloney's Island Distillery. Fun fact, Canada was actually the first country in the world to make it a legal requirement for whiskey to be aged in barrels through legislation in 1887. Now, Greenland has been a whiskey-making country since 2014 with the launch of Icefjord Premium Arctic Single Malt Whiskey. They produce an award-winning peated and unpeated single malt made with centuries-old iceberg water, and Q Distillery is also laying down whiskey barrels. Now, Mexico has a really new craft whiskey industry that really leans into its agricultural traditions. So when they first released a whiskey in 2020, it wasn't a direct copy of bourbon. The Abaslo Ancestral Corn Whiskey uses 100% ancestral Cacahuacintul corn and nixtamalization, which is a 4,000-year-old cooking technique used to prepare corn for tortillas. But when using this cooking technique to make whiskey, it's meant to produce a lot of really roasted and earthy flavors. The distillery is also one of the highest in the world, at 7,800 feet. So at that altitude, the aging process is also quite unique. But since then, Mexico has also seen a number of other whiskies emerge, things like the Yucatan-based Gran Mazel, which also uses ancient corn varieties. There's also Sierra Norte, Curdo Negro, and Origin 35. Now, if you know your Prohibition history, you may have heard of Saint Pierre and Miquelon. It's a French archipelago just south of Newfoundland, and it's only home to about 6,000 residents, but during Prohibition, it was a major hub for alcohol smuggling. And so in 2018, the Saint Pierre Miquelon distillery was established to revive this history, and in 2024 released their 3-year-old single malt, made and aged on the island. Am I missing anyone else in North America? Oh yeah, the United States. Whiskey has been made in the US since the 1600s by Irish and Scottish immigrants. Throughout the 1700s, the process adapted and innovated to suit the local conditions, so using things like corn and rye, transporting whiskey in barrels saw American oak become rather a norm for aging, and other innovations to reach the point of American whiskey that we know today. While the US is best known for bourbon whiskey with brands like Jim Beam, Maker's Mark, and Buffalo Trace, as well as rye whiskey like Rittenhouse Rye, Bullet Rye, and Michter's, there are several other whiskey styles like Jack Daniel's Tennessee whiskey, corn whiskies like Mellow Corn and Balcones Baby Blue, and there are also Scottish-style single malts being made like Stranahan's and Westwood whiskey. Moving down to Central America and the Caribbean, in Grenada, the Welcome Stone Distilling Co. is credited with being the producer of the first Caribbean whiskey, aptly named Caribbean whiskey. In spite of the tropical climate causing accelerated aging, it is still aged for 6 years, which is actually really impressive. Honduras's first, and as far as I can tell, only whiskey, actually has a really cool story. It was first released in 2023 as a collaboration between LA20 Imperial Stout Craft Beer and Clandestino Distilling Company, which is also a Prohibition-style speakeasy bar. They distilled the locally produced stout beer and aged it in a combination of oak and cherry wood. The result is meant to be bold and smoky with flavors of coffee, chocolate, and maple, but it is a proper craft release in that it's really only available sporadically, even in Honduras. The first whiskey ever produced in Panama is La Rana Dorada Single Malt, made by a local craft brewery. It was aged 3 years in virgin American oak and first released in 2022. But you also have Centeno 7. It's a craft whiskey, supposedly Canadian style, made from a single locally sourced grain. They don't say what grain, but considering they call themselves Canadian style, you would assume that that might be rye, but I can tell that it is actually aged in virgin white oak. Although Puerto Rico is best known for rum, they do kind of have a whiskey. There's a product called Buca whiskey, which is made in Puerto Rico and is grain-based spirit, but then it's also blended with port wine, which is probably delicious, but doesn't classify it as a whiskey by most countries' standards. But there is still a proper whiskey on the horizon. There is a micro distillery, Distilleria Capellan, that began laying down barrels in 2023 and is meant to be releasing a single barrel, single malt by the end of this year. And now moving down to South America, Argentina actually has quite a few whiskey distilleries, but the very first was La Alazana Distillery, which first released a single malt in 2014. It's a field-to-bottle whiskey made from locally grown barley and Patagonian spring water. I've actually tried this one and really enjoyed it, but since then a number of craft distilleries have also popped up producing craft whiskies. Things like Madoc Distillery using Andean-grown corn, and Casa Negra making single malt aged in Mendozan wine casks. Bolivia has one distillery producing whiskey, the Andean Culture Distillery, producing Quilla Amburana. Now these sound like really unique whiskies shaped by the local terroir. They're made using chica, a Bolivian fermented corn beverage. Corn is a grain, it's still whiskey, along with wheat and Amazonian malts, and distilled at 13,000 feet. Now that altitude lowers the boiling point for alcohol, so it produces a very different flavor. And that spirit is then aged in Roble Chicotano, an oak native to eastern Bolivia. Brazil's first whiskey producer was Union Distillery, which first started distilling malt whiskey in 1972. But the bulk of this was being sent off to Japan to be used as bulk blending stock. In the 1980s, they released their first blended whiskies, but these were mostly for the export market. It was only in 2019 that they started bottling and releasing whiskies under their own label for the local and global market. But since then, Lamas Destilario released the first Brazilian single malt in 2019. Alba and Weber House are both laying down barrels with plans to release whiskies in the near future, and there are even some independent bottlers in the country. Chile became a whiskey producing country just this decade, with Wufco Chilean Single Malt, first released in 2023, made from Araucanian malt and peat from Patagonia. There's now the Old Bastard Distillery, producing American-style moonshine, but their first aged spirit release, the Ayers Reserve Chilean Whiskey, won silver at the London Spirits Competition in 2025. And there are a few more craft distillers throughout the country also laying down whiskey barrels. Colombia has at least one distillery producing whiskey, Piatl, an 8-year-old small batch whiskey made from Capio corn and aged in French oak in the Andean highlands. Just over the border in Ecuador, the first locally made whiskey was released in 2021. Merco is a single malt made by Andes Spirits and also aged up in the Andean highlands. In the same year, Distilleria Sabo released their first whiskey, aged in native Ecuadorian Pichiche barrels. Good Omen distillers are also laying down barrels with plans to release a whiskey. Paraguay actually had a foray into whiskey making in the 1980s. APAL partnered with the Morris and Bowmore distillers in Scotland to produce a Paraguayan whiskey they were calling Old Cottage, but the coup of 1989 brought an end to that project. Flash forward to today, and the state-owned Capasa is planning to revive that project to release a Paraguayan-made whiskey. However, the project in the 1980s was planning to release a spirit that was based on malt, rye, and sugarcane spirit. So if they're going to follow that same recipe, it's technically not going to be a whiskey. Not only does Peru have locally made whiskey, they also have a protected classification for Andean whiskey. So it must be produced in Peru and contain a mash bill of at least 51% Andean corn. The first whiskey released with this classification was Black Whiskey in 2019 by Don Michael Distillery, made from 60% Andean black corn, 30% malted wheat and 10% malted barley. It actually won World's Best Whiskey at the 2022 New York World Spirits Competition. So far, this seems to be the only whiskey made in Peru, but you would think with that sort of classification and protection that they're planning on a much wider whiskey industry. Lastly, Uruguay has been producing whiskey for decades through the state-owned ANCAP, but it's really difficult to work out what exactly is Uruguayan whiskey. There are a number of brands that use imported Scotch blended with local spirits to produce local labels. I don't really call that whiskey, but then some of their brands call themselves Scotch while claiming to be locally produced. As best as I can tell, Gregson's whiskey has been locally produced in Uruguay since 1969. And this differs from some of the other more ambiguous whiskey brands because Gregson's also has Gregson's Gold label that promotes itself as being more premium because it is blended with Scotch. So Uruguay claims to have a lot of locally produced whiskies, but it looks like they really only have one. And lastly, let's head over to the most unexpected region, for me anyway, of Africa and the Middle East. First up is Cameroon, which was actually the hardest of the countries to really properly nail it down, but it does seem to have at least one locally made whiskey. It's called Wilson Whiskey, and it's made at the Firmencam Distillery by Faux Group, which makes beers and a wide range of spirits. Egypt entered the modern whiskey scene in 2004 with the release of Old Stag Smooth Blended Whiskey. The label does state that it is made under license from William MacLeod and Sons of Edinburgh, Scotland, but the product is distilled, aged and bottled in Egypt. Now since then you've also got Devlin Single Malt Whiskey, which was released in 2018, but other whiskey brands in Egypt tend to be a blend of locally produced spirit and imported Scotch. Ethiopia does have a small but growing whiskey industry. Now you find plenty of products that have been blended with imported Scotch and locally made spirits, but there is at least one locally made whiskey called Black Deer Whiskey. Israel has been making whiskey since 2013. Many would have heard of the Milk and Honey Distillery, which won the award for World's Best Single Malt in 2023, but there's also Golan Heights Distillery, Pelter Distillery, and Slingshot. The industry doesn't seem to have a preferred style, with single malts, grain whiskies, and even Kentucky-style corn whiskies all being produced. In 2019, Lebanon released its first whiskey with the Ethias Single Malt, but since then Watani Whiskey, a blend, has also been released. There's also Glenby, but this is a Scottish whiskey that's been matured in Lebanon. There is a Namibian whiskey, and it is very unique to the local environment. It's made by the Irongo Mountain Winery, and the whiskey is called Onjaba, which is the Avombo word for elephant, for good reason. It's described as having a distinctive, slightly earthy tobacco-like aroma because it is made using African grains along with maize, wheat, rye, and malt, which are then smoked using burning elephant dung. The spirit is then aged in a combination of virgin oak, red wine barrels, brandy, and wine liqueur barrels. Now, I've had whiskies made with burning sheep dung, and they're actually quite good, so I'm really keen to try this one. Rwanda actually has a few whiskies, the first of which was 1000 Hills Whiskey, which was only released in 2019. Since then, you have the Advent Group producing Grandsire Whiskey, Swag Whiskey, Mambo, Cavort, and Golden Barrel Whiskey. We're finishing at the bottom in South Africa, which entered the whiskey market in 1977 with the release of 3 ships. But this product was made using a combination of Scottish whiskey and locally made spirit. So they couldn't put whiskey on the label, they had to call it unspecified spirit, which really instills confidence. They were able to release it as 3 Ships Whiskey in 1981 after it had been aged for 3 years, but this was still a blended product using imported Scotch. It was in 2003 that 3 Ships 10-year-old single malt was released as the first ever single malt fully distilled, matured and bottled in South Africa using locally malted barley. In 2009, Bain's Cape Mountain Whisky was released as the country's first 100% single grain whisky. There is also Boplas whisky produced at the Calitzdorp winery. While there aren't a lot of countries across Africa and the Middle East producing whisky, still way more than I expected, whisky is still a really popular drink in the region, with a lot of countries importing Scotch and blending it with their own locally made spirits, including Kenya, Tanzania, Zambia, Zimbabwe, and Mauritius. And this is sometimes a precursor to releasing a completely locally produced spirit, so the region is worth keeping an eye on. So how did that total number compare to your first guess? Now keep in mind, there are 195 countries in the world, so that is half the world making whiskey. And there's probably even a few countries that I either missed or have released a whiskey since I first posted this video. So if you know of any that aren't in this list, please let me know in the comments below. I'm a whiskey explorer. I always love finding new whiskeys. But no matter where in the world you are, no matter where your whiskey is made, enjoy what's in your glass and sláinte. If anyone's wondering, this is Chinese whiskey made using Scottish Island peat drunk by an Australian guy.